My name is Elliot Grayson. I'm 46 years old and work as a financial systems architect at Everwind Capital in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've spent the past 18 years building fraud detection frameworks for high-risk clients. Systems that don't blink, don't judge, just flag patterns and protect wealth. If you're listening and this story resonates, please subscribe, like, and share this video to support stories that reveal truth and justice. Your support helps others see what betrayal looks like behind polished smiles. It was a Wednesday morning. I was reviewing automated report anomalies on a municipal pension fund account when my phone lit up with a message from my wife, Madeline. She was supposed to be in Denver for a healthcare innovation summit. The message was just 2 lines. I want a divorce. I've found someone who makes me feel alive again. And then another one. I've already moved our retirement savings into my personal account. You can keep the house. I didn't respond right away. I just put my coffee down, logged into the Vault system, and opened our linked accounts dashboard. It took all of 8 seconds for the system to register the unauthorized movement. Not just unusual, non-compliant. I stared at the screen. She didn't just break my trust. She tripped 6 federal fraud alerts in a single transaction. I didn't yell. Didn't pace. Didn't throw my phone across the room like some betrayed husband in a TV drama. I just stared at the numbers shifting across the screen, transaction IDs lighting up red in the back-end system I designed myself. Madeline thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late. That's what stung the most. Not the money, not the betrayal itself, but the calculated confidence she must have had. Like I'd be too distracted at work, too trusting, too late. But the system was never built for trust. It was built for timing, pattern recognition, digital flags, triggers based on velocity and access discrepancies. And Madeline, in her rush to leave cleanly, had triggered every one of them. By the time the 3rd alert sounded, one tied to a transfer from a retirement fund to an account she hadn't disclosed, I knew federal protocols had already begun freezing the outbound activity. There wasn't a single thing I had to do. I leaned back in my chair and watched it all happen in real time. The machine didn't care she was my wife. Didn't care she said she was in Denver when she was actually elsewhere. It just knew the numbers didn't make sense. That afternoon, while she was boarding a flight to who knows where with who knows who, the institution she tried to use to receive the money sent its own alert. Review initiated. Deposits on hold pending investigation. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even exhale. I just closed the window, recentered the dashboard, and went back to work. Someone else's future was waiting for my protection. The call came 2 days later, just before lunch on Friday. I let it ring twice before picking up. Her name flashed across my screen, Madeline Grayson. I hadn't heard her voice since the morning she boarded the flight to Denver that never happened. "Elliot, something's wrong," she said, trying to sound composed but missing the mark by a mile. "My debit card isn't working. It's saying insufficient funds." I stayed silent for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle between us. "What's your current balance?" I asked flatly. She paused. "0. I don't understand. I transferred the funds." "You're right about that," I interrupted. "And those transfers triggered every fraud protocol the system's ever seen." There was a sharp inhale on her end, followed by silence. I could picture her standing somewhere unfamiliar, clutching her phone, trying to wrap her head around what had just happened. "What did you do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said truthfully. "The system flagged unauthorized access to federally protected retirement funds. Large withdrawals without joint authorization are subject to mandatory review. That's federal law. Not me. More silence. I heard voices in the background. Maybe an airport, maybe not. "How long will it be locked?" she asked, her voice smaller now. 5 to 7 business days. Maybe longer if they uncover anything concerning. She didn't say goodbye. Just hung up. I sat at my desk in my home office, staring at the closed call screen. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. There was a shift in me, quiet, definitive. For 18 years, I had built systems to protect companies from financial collapse. And now, the same precision that once saved billion-dollar funds had just stopped my wife from draining our future without saying a word to my face. That night, I didn't call her mother, didn't text my brother. I didn't even tell my colleagues what happened. What could I say? That my wife of 20 years had tried to steal our retirement and vanished into thin air with someone who makes her feel alive? Instead, I reheated leftover soup, watched the market recap on local news, and checked the fraud flags one more time before bed. Everything was still locked, every transfer frozen, every attempt flagged and documented. What hurt wasn't the betrayal. It was how efficient it had been. A message, a few clicks, a vanishing act. No confrontation, no tears, not even a goodbye worth hearing in person. It felt like closing a contract, not ending a marriage. I found myself scrolling through old pictures on my phone. Madeline smiling on a trip to Asheville, laughing with my sister on Christmas Eve. For a moment, I wondered if any of it had been real, or just well-practiced performance from someone planning an exit. But the system didn't wonder. It didn't question motives or search for meaning. It just documented every anomaly. That was its strength. What made it so effective in a world where trust, I'd come to learn, was optional. Data didn't lie. People did. Looking back, the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. 6 months ago, Madeline stopped asking about our retirement projections. That was odd. She used to obsess over numbers whenever we talked about early retirement or buying a second property. Then, 3 months ago, she opened a new credit card without saying a word. When I questioned it, she brushed it off. "It's just for travel perks," she said, smiling like always. 2 weeks before the transfer, she made a passing comment about how cluttered the guest room was. "No one visits anymore anyway," she muttered while folding laundry. I hadn't thought much of it until that night. She hadn't been stressed. She'd been calculating. I realized then, Madeline had been watching me, not lovingly, strategically, observing how I designed systems, what I monitored, where I logged in from, what alerts I ignored. She thought she'd found the gaps. But there were no gaps. Every account was connected, every transaction monitored, not because I didn't trust her, but because I built my systems to catch fraud where emotion tends to look away. That Tuesday night, just before she left for the fake summit in Denver, she leaned over dinner and asked, "How much do we have total in retirement?" I told her. $820,000 across all funds. "Just curious," she said. Now, that curiosity had a motive, and I was living inside its answer. I thought about calling her best friend, Lena, or maybe her dad. Not to accuse, just to make sense of it all. But the words felt too surreal. Madeline tried to drain our retirement and got caught by my software. Wasn't exactly something you could say without sounding unhinged. So I didn't say anything. Instead, I printed out the latest fraud reports, organized screenshots of the flag transfers, and stored them in a labeled folder. Grayson, Incident, March. It was my way of regaining control, treating it like a case, not a marriage imploding. That night, I made myself dinner. Steak, barely seasoned, and a single glass of Cabernet. The kitchen was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that reminds you just how much noise you'd gotten used to. I checked the alerts one last time before bed. The funds were still frozen. Review pending. No updates. The house felt colder than usual, like it knew what had changed. Madeline had bet on me not paying attention. She forgot who she married. By Friday afternoon, my phone had racked up 23 unread messages, all from Madeline. They started off sharp, accusatory. "What did you do?" "You're sabotaging me." Then they turned frantic. "I can't access anything. I need you to fix this." And eventually, quiet. Just one last line. "Please, Elliot." I didn't respond. What was there to say? That the system she once laughed at for being too cautious just saved our life savings? That the man she called overly methodical had quietly outmaneuvered her without even lifting a finger? Instead, I opened a new browser tab and pulled up a divorce attorney in Charlotte. Mason Avery LLP. Simple name. Direct approach. The consultation was short and to the point. File immediately. Document everything. Attempted misappropriation of funds will weigh in your favor. The next business day, the papers were filed. No request for alimony. No division of protected assets. The house remained mine. The untouched joint account, with its modest balance of $3,200, was left alone. She could have that part. But everything else? The future? Integrity? That was staying with me. By Sunday morning, Madeline had lawyered up. And not just any lawyer. Patricia Conway, the kind of family law attorney who bragged about strategic divorce outcomes at neighborhood wine nights. They filed a motion claiming I had deliberately orchestrated the account freeze as retaliation. Her legal brief used phrases like weaponizing financial expertise and intentional deprivation of marital assets. It would have been laughable if it weren't so hollow. I forwarded the court documents to my attorney, Mason Avery, and scheduled a call. He skimmed the complaint silently, then let out a quiet chuckle. "They're trying to frame an automated system as a personal attack," he said. "That's bold." I nodded. "She thinks I pushed a button." He shook his head. "You built a system that doesn't need you to push anything. That's the difference." We agreed to let the logs speak for themselves. Timestamps, IP addresses, verification failures. It was all there. Clean, irrefutable, emotionless. Tricia could spin whatever narrative she wanted. But the truth didn't care about spin. It was already logged in the system. Documented, immutable. Ready for court. That night, the house phone rang. No caller ID. I almost didn't pick up. "Elliot," she said the moment I answered. "You need to call the bank. Tell them it was authorized. I'm stranded." Her voice had that edge I recognized. Restrained panic masked as irritation. I leaned back in my chair, glancing at the fireplace she'd insisted we upgrade last winter. "Where are you?" "Phoenix," she said after a pause. "I'm staying with friends." "Phoenix isn't Denver." Silence. "I had to make a detour," she added. "It's complicated." "I'm sure it is." "Don't start," she snapped. "I'm just asking. Did you notify the summit organizer, your boss at Metagenics? Or were they in on the detour too?" Click. She hung up. I looked at the quiet line for a moment, then returned to my screen. Fraud logs were still stacking. New flags, minor discrepancies. Her travel expenses were inconsistent with the Denver itinerary she'd shared. No hotel check-in, no digital badge scans, no receipts. If she thought the worst part was over, she was wrong. The system wasn't finished with her yet. By Tuesday morning, my system flagged something new. 3 separate credit card applications had been submitted using our shared home address. each one in Madeline's name, each one denied. The denial codes were all the same. Pending fraud investigation. She was trying to bypass the freeze, claw her way into liquidity through any loophole she could find. But the net had already tightened. No valid income, no cleared accounts, no unsecured lines of credit. Just a spiral of desperation. Later that afternoon, Patricia Conway, her attorney, called my office directly. "This is getting excessive," she began, as if we were co-parenting a golden retriever instead of navigating federal compliance. "Your wife needs access to basic living expenses." I stayed calm. There's over $3,000 sitting in the joint checking account. It's untouched. That's hardly sufficient for someone in her situation. It's the same cushion we've always kept there. For emergencies, which I suppose this now qualifies as. There was a long pause. Then, without another word, Patricia hung up. The silence said more than she realized. They'd expected a man who'd fall apart. Instead, they found the system still standing. The next morning brought a surprise I hadn't anticipated, not from Madeline, not from Patricia, but from Alan Trent, the director of operations at Metagenics, Madeline's company. "Elliot, I hope I'm not overstepping," he said cautiously. "But was Madeline actually attending the Denver summit this week?" I hesitated. "You'd have to ask her that." "We did," he replied. "HR has no record of her registration, no flight reimbursements, nothing logged in our internal travel system." I leaned back in my chair, a tightness growing behind my ribs. "We've also noticed some irregularities in her recent expense reports," he continued. "We're reviewing everything, but I thought you should know." I gave the only honest answer I had. "I can't speak to her professional behavior, but thank you for letting me know." He sighed. "If she contacts you, could you—" "I think that's between her and your compliance team now." The call ended. The implications didn't. This wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore. It was becoming something else. Something bigger. Something criminal. That afternoon, the investigation deepened. A compliance officer from our financial institution reached out. "Mr. Grayson, we've identified several unusual transfers over the past 18 months. Movements between business and personal accounts, all originating from the same IP address associated with your home network." I sat still, listening. They weren't just talking about our retirement funds anymore. They were talking about Metagenics. The implications unraveled faster than I could breathe them in. Madeline hadn't just tried to rob our future. She'd been siphoning company funds through shadow accounts and redirecting them under false categories. All from our shared devices. All while I was building systems to protect others from this very thing. My quiet, structured life had been detonated from the inside. Marriage? Compromised. Trust eviscerated. Even my own home, once a place of control and logic, now felt like a crime scene wired for silent theft. But I hadn't pushed her toward this. I'd simply built the thing that caught her in the act. And now that system was opening doors neither of us could close. By Thursday morning, Patricia Conway filed an emergency motion in family court, petitioning for immediate access to additional marital assets, citing unjustified financial hardship on Madeline's behalf. The judge set a hearing for the next day. Fast-tracked, no delays. I spent the evening preparing, methodically. Pulled every flagged alert, every failed authorization attempt, every transaction timestamp that told the real story. I didn't need to argue. I just needed to show the data. That night, Madeline sent one last message. "I'm sorry it came to this." I stared at it for a moment, and then locked my phone. The next day, the courtroom felt like a formality. The judge reviewed the documentation in silence, skimming page after page of audit trails and system-generated flags. "This is not a case of willful deprivation," she concluded. "Access to the joint checking account is sufficient while formal investigations proceed." Just like that, Madeline's motion was denied. She walked out without looking at me. No anger, no words. Just the realization that the system she tried to outsmart had closed the door behind her. The following Monday, a man in a gray suit knocked on the glass door of my office. He introduced himself as Gregory Hale, an investigator from Southeast Financial Compliance. His tone was formal, but not unfriendly. "Mr. Grayson, we've reviewed the alerts your system generated. They led us to something bigger. We'd like your help." I motioned for him to sit. Over coffee in the small conference room down the hall, he laid it out. Over a dozen flagged transactions connecting Madeline to company accounts she had no business accessing. The numbers didn't lie. The patterns pointed to a much larger scheme. "She wasn't acting alone," he said. "We've identified a second party, Jason Kerr, an executive in Metagenix's marketing division. They were rerouting budget funds into shell accounts for nearly 2 years." I said nothing for a long moment. The floor felt oddly distant, like my feet no longer touched ground. "How much?" "Estimated total sits around 2 million. Could climb higher." I swallowed hard. While I'd been safeguarding our home finances, Madeline had been building a house of cards with someone else. But my system didn't let it stand. It didn't forgive. It simply found the pattern and exposed it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the numbers in my head. Transfers, account names, timestamps. Trying to make sense of what I'd missed, if anything. By morning, I was done second-guessing. I forwarded the entire audit log from my system to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Every flagged transaction, every trigger alert, every cross-referenced anomaly. Not out of vengeance. Not out of anger. Out of duty. Out of clarity. Madeline hadn't just tried to dismantle our life. She had helped construct a criminal enterprise, and the evidence was sitting in my hands. My system hadn't been designed for revenge. It had been built for protection. And now, it was doing exactly that. That afternoon, she sent a single line of text. "They're saying it's federal charges. I didn't think it would go this far." I didn't answer. What could I possibly say? That it only went that far because she thought I wouldn't notice? That she counted on me to stay quiet while she emptied everything we built? Number I had already responded. With evidence. With precision. With the system she once told me was paranoid. Turns out it wasn't paranoid. It was prepared. The next morning, my realtor James Eldridge called. "Elliot, I got a strange inquiry this weekend. Someone claiming to represent you and Madeline. They asked about listing your home at its original purchase price. Pre-approved cash offer. Very aggressive." I felt my chest tighten. What number did they give? 300,000, not a dollar more. 5 years ago, that would have been fair. Today the property was worth nearly 5. Someone was trying to offload it at a loss and pocket the gain. "Who submitted the inquiry?" He hesitated. "Guy named Jason Kerr." I didn't respond right away. But the name hit hard. The same Jason from Metagenix, the one tied to Madeline's shell transfers. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about strategy. They weren't just stealing. They were planning an exit. Buy the house through a third party. Flip it. Disappear with the difference. A clean break masked as a real estate deal. I hung up the phone, heart pounding, not from panic, but from confirmation. She wasn't impulsive. She was methodical, just like me, only with a different kind of math. The next day, I met with Detective Sarah Flynn from the Charlotte Financial Crimes Division. She was direct, methodical, no wasted words. After a brief handshake, she laid out the findings like a spreadsheet. 12 families, she said, all victims of a coordinated real estate fraud operation. Undervalued sales, pressure tactics, hidden buyers. Your case triggered it all. I sat quietly, letting it sink in. They used company access to identify employees and financial strain, she continued. Then worked angles, some fast cash offers, some falsified appraisals. Your audit system picked up transfer anomalies that no one else caught. I glanced at the printed reports in front of her. Dozens of homes. Lives rearranged by greed dressed as opportunity. Mine had just happened to be the one that bit back. I wasn't proud. I wasn't even angry anymore. I just felt resolute. I'd spent years building tools to protect institutions from internal threats. Turns out those tools had protected something far more personal. And now they were helping others too. 12 families, 12 homes, all exposed by a system designed to see what people tried to hide. That Thursday, Patricia Conway tried one last desperate move, an emergency petition to access the frozen retirement funds. She claimed Madeline's basic needs were being denied, that the freeze was unjust, that I was leveraging my knowledge to punish her financially. The judge didn't take long. She reviewed the system logs, the federal guidelines, the timestamps showing Madeline's unauthorized attempts to move 6 figures without joint consent. This isn't personal, the judge said plainly. It's protocol. The motion was denied. Again. Madeline stood beside Patricia, stone-faced in a gray suit 2 sizes too large. Her posture was different. Shoulders low, eyes darting instead of sharp. She didn't look defiant anymore. She looked cornered. As we stepped into the hallway, she turned to me for the first time in weeks. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you just let it go?" I looked at her, calm and level. "Why did you think I wouldn't notice?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The system had answered for her. Quietly, precisely, and without an ounce of emotion. The following Monday, I received a visitor at the office. Gregory Hale again, this time with a briefcase and a badge from the U.S. Attorney's Office. "We've completed the first round of analysis," he said, "and we're preparing indictments." I nodded, unsure whether to feel relief or something colder. "Mr. Grayson," he continued, "your system flagged patterns we didn't see, deep account trails, mirrored logins, multiple IP masks. We've confirmed a long-term conspiracy involving 6 individuals at Metagenics." He handed me a folder. Inside were names, charges, timestamps, screenshots. At the center of it, Madeline Grayson, listed as lead coordinator. The woman I once shared tax returns and vacation plans with was now identified as the architect of a corporate embezzlement network. "We'll need your full cooperation," Gregory said, "and documentation proving you had no involvement." I already had it. Backups, logs, email chains. My system hadn't just caught her, it had protected me too. I handed him a drive. "Everything you need is on here." Justice wasn't about fury or revenge. It was about records. And mine were airtight. That Tuesday, I got another call from James Eldridge, my realtor. "Elliot, we've had a new inquiry about your house. Someone claiming to represent both you and Madeline again, offering cash, same low valuation." I didn't even have to ask. "Was it Kerr?" he exhaled. "Yeah. Same guy, same tactic." The pieces locked into place. It hadn't been a whim. They'd planned everything: drain the accounts, flip the house, disappear. Clean profit, no trace. Except there was a trace. My system had flagged every step before they could erase their footprints. And now, the house was evidence. I filed a request to block any title activity pending investigation. Within 48 hours, a property fraud hold was in place. Later that night, I sat in the guest room Madeline once called cluttered. I boxed up old photo albums, folded blankets we hadn't touched in years, and looked around the walls like a stranger. The space didn't feel like ours anymore. It hadn't in a long time. It was never about the house. It was about the intent. About how far someone will go to rewrite a future. At your expense. By Thursday, Patricia Conway filed another motion. This time to access the frozen retirement accounts through an emergency financial hardship appeal. Third attempt in less than a month. It was denied within the hour. The judge's language was firm. There is no evidence of malicious intent by Mr. Grayson. These are federally mandated holds triggered by automated systems. The court will not override protocol for convenience. Later that day, I received a call from Patricia. Your client, she said, her voice unusually quiet, is not prepared for what's coming. The federal inquiry is expanding. She needs to consider her legal exposure. I didn't say anything. She's asking if you'd consider a private conversation. She wants to explain. I looked out the window of my home office. The trees were beginning to bloom, life moving forward despite everything. Tell her I'll testify, I said, but only about what I know, what I saw, the systems, the fraud, not our marriage. There was silence. Then Patricia sighed. You understand this could affect sentencing. I'm not here to negotiate a sentence, I replied. I'm here to close a chapter. And I meant it. Friday morning, I walked into the federal courthouse carrying a small black folder. Inside it, the system logs that started it all. Testifying wasn't hard. It wasn't emotional either, just facts. I explained the alert thresholds, the account structures, the logic tree that flagged unauthorized access. No dramatics, no anger, just process. A machine built to see what people preferred to ignore. The prosecutor asked, Did you ever access your wife's accounts without consent? No, I said clearly. The system monitored only joint financial activity. It was designed to flag patterns, not people. Another question followed. When did you realize your wife might be involved in something larger? When the system caught her making transfers she knew required dual authorization. She thought I wouldn't notice. The room was silent for a beat too long. That silence said more than testimony ever could. I wasn't a man betrayed. I was a witness to a digital confession. One written not in words, but in numbers. By day 12 of the trial, the weight shifted. Jason Kerr, the marketing executive tied to Madeline, folded. Took a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence and full cooperation. What followed was brutal and precise. Jason outlined everything. The budget diversions, the shell accounts, the internal document tampering. And he named Madeline as the organizer. She ran the schedules, he testified. Made sure the numbers looked clean on every quarterly report. She learned it from him, her husband. Said his systems were overkill. Turns out she built her own version. For us. I didn't flinch. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd copied my discipline, mirrored my logic, but used it to hide theft instead of uncover it. The prosecution played recorded calls. In one, Madeline laughed. Elliot's too obsessed with his own systems to ever check mine. That line echoed. 20 years of marriage. 2 decades of shared silence, plans, trust. And behind it all, she was betting on my respect for boundaries to become her shield. Nearly worked. Until the system saw through both of us. On the final day of trial, the verdict came down. 12 counts of wire fraud, 8 of conspiracy, and 2 of corporate embezzlement. Madeline Grayson stood silent as the charges were read, eyes unfocused, her posture hollowed by weeks of courtroom exposure. I didn't watch her closely. I didn't need to. The evidence had done its work. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited, but I didn't stop. No statements, no press. I walked straight to my truck, keys in hand, jacket folded over my arm like I'd just left a long meeting. Because in a way, I had. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't closure. It was a system fulfilling its purpose, catching deception before it could finish what it started. 2 months later, sentencing was delivered. Madeline received 18 years. Jason Kerr, 9. I sold the house in Charlotte for just over $500,000, closed the chapter clean, and moved to a 1-story home in Wilmington. Quieter, smaller, no guest room, no reminders. I kept my job at Everwin Capital. And I added new layers to the fraud detection system, filters that would have flagged everything even faster. Because sometimes, systems don't just save your money. They save your future. The divorce finalized quietly. No disputes, no courtroom drama, just signatures and silence. Madeline's guilty plea left no room for contesting assets. The house was already sold. The retirement funds, fully restored and legally secured under my name. She didn't ask for alimony. There was nothing left to divide. A few weeks later, William Avery, my attorney, called with an update. The court approved full restitution. All flagged assets are protected. You're clear. I thanked him, then packed the last of the boxes from my new place. It wasn't much, just essentials and a few things I actually cared to keep. Clean walls, quiet space. Wilmington suited me better than I expected. I started teaching part-time at a local college, Cape Atlantic University. Fraud detection, financial security, case studies from real-world data. Students listened closely when I spoke. They weren't just learning numbers. They were learning what happens when trust fails. Trust, I told them, is important. But systems don't forget. They don't get tired. They don't ignore the signs. For the first time in a long while, I believed in the life I was rebuilding. Not out of grief, but from structure, from truth, from the math that never lied. Every few months, I'd get a letter, handwritten, always from the same sender, Madeline Grayson, inmate number 42751, now residing at a federal correctional facility in Georgia. The tone varied, sometimes apologetic, sometimes reflective, sometimes just lonely. One letter stood out. I got lost in the numbers, she wrote. Started seeing how easy it was. Jason said your system could be worked around. I believed him instead of you. I'm sorry. I read it once, then slid it into a file folder labeled Case Archive. Personal. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted her to suffer, not because I was angry, but because forgiveness isn't always owed, especially when the betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was systemic, strategic, cold. I didn't hate her, but I also didn't trust her with another second of my peace. The systems I'd built continued to work without emotion. They flagged behavior, not promises. They tracked anomalies, not apologies. And that's how I chose to live too. Anchored in the math, not the memories. 3 years later, my mornings are quiet. Black coffee, 2 eggs. Market data scrolling across a silent screen. No alerts, no transfers. Just peace. Delivered in clean lines and consistent numbers. I still teach part-time. Financial forensics at Cape Atlantic University. Room 204. Same seats. Same questions from students, hoping they'll never need what I teach them. Trust but verify, I always say. Because systems protect what emotion overlooks. Sometimes I drive past Metagenics' new campus. Shiny, rebranded, sanitized from the inside out. 12 families received restitution. Dozens more protected by protocols that now bear my name. Madeline is still serving her sentence. Her last letter went unopened, not out of cruelty, just clarity. The life I have now isn't flashy, but it's honest, and built from truth, not illusions. If you've listened this far, then maybe you've seen what I've seen. That betrayal doesn't always shout. Sometimes it logs in silently, line by line. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because the next person facing silence might need to hear how patterns, like people, can't hide forever.